Well, I think our policy towards China is the right one. We keep the diplomatic pressure on them. We shine the spotlight on their human rights abuses. We raise it at the highest levels. But we continue a mutually beneficial trade relationship with them, which is helping to create a middle class in China, which I hope this day comes very soon in Cuba and China and Vietnam and elsewhere, where they move to a more benign democratic system that respects the broad scope of rights. But that'll be more achievable if there's a broad, educated middle class that's more economically independent. And I think lifting the embargo against Cuba, it's not going to be a magic bullet. The Cubans are poor because of their failed socialist model, not because of the embargo. But the embargo has made them a little bit poorer without making Cubans one bit freer. I say let's lift the embargo, let's give free markets, capitalism, free trade a chance to benefit the Cuban people and Americans.
Frank, how do you explain the difference between our approach to China and our approach to Cuba?
Well, first of all, China is no longer the hostile regime that Cuba remains. There's no question that Cuba's leadership with Venezuela, with Syria, with many others remains a concern of the United States. Furthermore, people should go and look at what Fidel said. Fidel said that the blockade was a failure and that the revolution didn't need the embargo to be lifted. Now they want to change their mind. As far as free trade, there's no free trade with Cuba. I believe free trade between free countries. There's no free trade. There's no labor unions in Cuba. Those who defend free trade 200 years ago were in favor of slavery. That was free trade. That's economic freedom. But the impact of those policies on the people is nowhere to be found.
Ray Walser, the difference between China and Cuba? Besides one being almost 100 times larger than the other, but...
Cuba is an island. Cuba is in the Western Hemisphere, a democratic hemisphere. It is a country which has sent hundreds of thousands of people scurrying to the United States. 20,000 leave on legal visas every year. It is a system that has failed. Trade with them, I think, will give the sort of oxygen to the Castro system, particularly to the Castro brothers. Remember, they are mortal. They will be passing. There will be transitions on the island in the Cuban Communist Party. So let's just, practical politics say it's not going to be lifted at this point. So let's just save our breath. Let's see what's happening with the current changes. Let's continue to focus on the political regime and the lack of freedom. Let's listen to a Ioannis Sanchez or Oscar Bisset, and not just to the Venceremos Brigade.
You could say that it's an irrational obsession of United States presidents for the past 50 years. But Anne Louise Bardag has a different take. You know Anne Louise Bardag, right? She wrote that this is a case of the Hatfields versus the McCoys, because of the relationship between Fidel Castro and the Diaz-Balards. You know, Fidel Castro was married to Mirta Diaz-Balart. And so according to Anne Louise Bardag, this is really a Hatfields versus McCoys situation. But I go back to my personal theory, which is that these Cuban-American politicians that I listed earlier have a thing going here where they benefit from the status quo and they want to keep it that way. They don't want the embargo to end. They like it the way it is.
It has provided an alibi to the Castro regime for half a century. Their explanation for their failures, their real failures and mismanagement of the economy, has been el bloqueo and not our own failures, nuestros fracasos.
They will always have excuses. Fidel already has said that it took 50 years of having the embargo, and now he needs another 50 years to recover from embargo. It is not. We're not talking about the Cuban people. You keep talking about trade between the American company and the Cuban government. There's no middle class in Cuba. The Cuban government has no interest in allowing a middle class.
We trade with state-owned corporations around the world. U.S. corporations trade with state-owned or largely state-owned corporations around the world.
But nobody claims that that's free trade. And as far as the China model is concerned, I am Cuban. How many years we have had the China policy? The president just received the Chinese dictator. Well, the Chinese Nobel laureate is in prison in China. I don't want that kind of policy toward Cuba. I want toward Cuba the policy the United States has toward Costa Rica, toward Chile, The Cubans are not a different kind of human being. They want the same rights that the people in South Africa wanted when they have their apartheid, which exists in Cuba.
Another place that we never ended diplomatic relations. Go ahead, Dan.
Second time Frank's brought up South Africa. Two huge differences between our sanctions against South Africa and against Cuba. One, those were multilateral sanctions against South Africa. We're virtually alone in our embargo against Cuba. Secondly, South Africa, while the franchise was limited to whites, they had at least a democracy among 5 million people where the pain of sanctions could work themselves up to the leaders. When we impose sanctions or an embargo against Cuba, the Cuban leaders don't suffer. They get their 3 square meals and their chauffeured cars and all that. They're insulated from it. It's the people.
Do you agree with Ray Walser that there's very little on the horizon to indicate a big change in the current policy?
That's correct. But again, the embargo's in place and nothing's changed. I think we need to change our policy first. It's not serving our national interests or the interests of the people of Cuba.